about time only in terms of setting time and place, but in how we can kind of speed time up in our narratives and slow them down. And that's pretty specific to some of the standards at each grade level. So if you have this from yesterday, the orange sheet, the narrative moves, this is one thing that's really good for revision, especially when you start looking at time and place and ways that you can construct sentences that indicate where you are and what you're doing, as well as phrases that kind of indicate those transitions. And then the back does the same kind of things for cause and effect, and when you're giving an example or zooming into something, which is another strategy that we're going to talk about today. But this is, Colin, this is how he teaches grammar. He uses it in the context of how you write and how you construct and how you create meaning. And so giving the kids those phrases that give them transitions from one idea to the next, and giving them kind of a menu of options for that. And then how are you going to construct your sentences? If you're having trouble with time or place or cause effect, like what can you do at the sentence level to get back to that and figure out how to make it more clear to your reader? So this is a really good strategy, good use for revision. In Jim's book, though, So What's the Story? He kind of goes through the idea of shaping time and narrative and how each grade level, just like we looked at yesterday with poetry, each grade level has an iteration of the standard. So just kind of make note of what your piece of that puzzle is yet again. There's another metaphor, right? Tell about the events in the order in which they occurred. That's what kindergarten is expected to do. First grade, recount 2 or more appropriately sequenced events. Use temporal words to signal event order. Kind of like the menu that Colin uses, you could do that with words that kids could use. Recount a well-elaborated event or short sequence at 2nd grade. From 3 to 5, you're going to be starting to work with clear event sequences. Organize an event sequence that unfolds naturally and logically. 6, 7, organize an event, again, same thing, but start to use transitional words as well. 8th, then you're starting to use transition words, phrases, and clauses. So just kind of ups the complexity every single year. And then we get to 9, 10. We want to have well-structured event sequences, create a smooth progression of experiences or events, sequence events that build on one another to create a coherent whole, and then ultimately we want them to get to the place where they have those event sequences, it's a smooth progression, they build on one another to create a coherent whole and build toward a particular tone and outcome. So we're kind of just working through that process with kids all the way through that K through 12 continuum when it comes to shaping time and narrative. So one of the things that we try to do, and we're going to use A Christmas Story as our example for all of these because it fits everything. One of the things you can try to do with narrative time is slow things down. So I'm sure we're all familiar with this scene when Ralphie is helping his dad with the car. So one thing to do with kids is show video clips of time slowing down and speeding up so they have a visual before they move to the written. This one, we like the Ralphie stuff for several reasons. Trouble, right? There's trouble there. What's going to happen when we get home, right? Which is the life buoy and the soap in the mouth. And then they call the friends, and the parents, and the screaming, what? My favorite is when she goes, you know where he heard that word? Probably from his father. Because you can kind of catch the dad grinning a little bit just as he turns around to go back in the car. Another kind of way to work with character that Jim talks about in his book is filter and slant. So the character we're following in that particular scene and the next one we're going to look at is Ralphie at age 10. But there's a slant to that because you have that narrator in the background who's older looking back at what happened to Ralphie. So that's another way to look at character besides just static, dynamic, right? Who the narrator is. Sometimes it's a narrator who's looking back at something and has a very different perspective than the person who's living the story at the time. So showing them the video clips is really helpful. So speeding up time all the way through the movie, like they do that again later. Okay, you know the scene, you know the bullies are there, so let's just speed through that because it's not really that essential to the narrative right now. Mm-hmm. So kind of talking through that in film with kids is really important because it does give them that visual, then you can move them to the written.
One moment where you can show it looks like Ralphie in that moment, or is there a place where that every day and you want to make it speed through and to let them experiment with the writing is going to give them that purpose for doing it, and then they can share it, and then they're actually just the writing, they're experimenting and working with language. So it could be in really rough ways, and then those are helping you get towards the bigger things that the goals you're working toward on, bigger writing projects.
So other strategies for revision as far as shaping time goes, mentor texts and models, which I brought up earlier, giving kids models of the kinds of things that you want them to do in their writing and allowing them to kind of see that as a mentor text, like, okay, I want to write like Hemingway. What does he do? There's sparse, not as many adjectives, adverbs, subject, verbs, small words, like there's a style to that. So if I'm trying to imitate that, then I want to look at a model that gives me something to imitate. So one strategy, and these are all from Barry Lane, is explode a moment, where you dig into the specifics of a situation. So you're kind of slowing time down. And kids do this a lot, and it's also kind of a show versus tell strategy. So the dog scared me. They'll say that. I'm like, well, I can't. What's happening? How? What did the dog do? So if you have that in a piece of writing, then you can go back to that and go, okay, let's be more specific. Let's show some details. On my morning run, as I turned a corner of my usual route on a path behind some houses, a huge Rottweiler unexpectedly shoved its muzzle between the slats of the fence and barked so loudly that I lost my footing. His teeth seemed to take up the expanse of his face. Now we see something, right? And we understand why you were scared. My already difficult breathing combined with my racing heart made it difficult to keep going, but I didn't stop until I got out of range of the barking noise. So explode that moment. Tell us what happened. Another one, the strategy that Barry Lane talks about, is shrinking a century. And we're actually going to practice that one a little bit. Sometimes authors need to shrink time to get to what is really important in the work. For example, we just talked about exploding a moment of Harold's job interview and show his reactions to the situation. If we need to skip to when or if Harold got the job, the author might say after 7 days, Harold heard the phone ring and knew it was the call he'd been waiting for. So we just shrunk that 7 days into one phrase. E.B. White, here's a good mentor text example for kids in Charlotte's Web. The early summer days on a farm are the happiest and fairest days of the year. Lilacs bloom and make the air sweet and then fade. Apple blossoms come with the lilacs, and the bees visit around among the apple trees. The days grow warm and soft, school ends, and children have time to play. Wouldn't you love school ends? Shrink that to 2 words. Yes. And children have time to play and to fish for trout in the brook. Avery often brought a trout home in his pocket, warm and stiff and ready to be fried for supper. Now that school was over, Fern visited the barn almost every day to sit quietly on her stool. The animals treated her as an equal. The sheep lay calmly at her feet. Around the 1st of July, the work horses were hitched to the mowing machine, and Mr. Zuckerman climbed into the seat and drove into the field. All morning you could hear the rattle of the machine as it went round and round, while the tall grass fell down behind the cutter bar in long green swaths. Next day, if there was no thunder shower, all hands would help rake and pitch and load, and the hay would be hauled to the barn in the hay wagon, with Fern and Avery riding at the top of the load. White goes from end of school to early summer to July in 3 paragraphs, more by the description of the things that happen at those times. Dickens shrinks the French Revolution in A Tale of Two Cities into 1 paragraph as the story begins. And we know the most famous line from that paragraph: it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. The whole French Revolution. So, what we'd like you to do, and you can work with a partner, is take one of the events that are listed there and summarize it in a sentence or a phrase. Shrink it down to a sentence or a phrase.